Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. We have a special episode for you this week. Excerpts from this year's C4ISRNet conference. Up first, reporter Nathan Strout talks to General David Thompson on how the Space Force's new Space Systems Command can help improve acquisitions.
Welcome to today's first keynote with General David D. Thompson, Vice Chief of Space Operations for the U.S. Space Force. General Thompson is responsible for assisting the Chief of Space Operations in organizing, training, and equipping Space Forces in the United States and overseas, integrating space policy and guidance, and coordinating space-related activities for the Space Force and Department of the Air Force. General Thompson, thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right into some questions. I want to start our conversation with a discussion of Space Systems Command, the second of 3 field commands to be created under the U.S. Space Force. General, how would you describe Space Systems Command, and how is it different from the Space and Missile Systems Center, which it is ostensibly replacing?
Good morning, Nathan, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you and the group this morning. Great question. I know you all are following some of the announcements we made in the last couple of weeks regarding the establishment of Space Systems Command. Really, what Space Systems Command does is a couple of things. First of all, it's responsible for developing, procuring, acquiring, and fielding the space capabilities that the Space Force needs to be an integral part of the joint force to provide those effects that make our military and our way of conducting military operations different than anybody else. The establishment of Space Systems Command is actually another step on a continuing journey to make our acquisition organizations and our acquisition processes more rapid, more agile, and more suited to the threat that we face today and the needs of the force. What specifically Space Systems Command did was it took the core of the work that had been done by Space and Missile Systems Center and J.T. Thompson over the last several years, what we called SMC 2.0, and does a couple of things. First of all, it adds in the responsibility and the requirement and the oversight of S&T related activities. The Air Force Research Laboratory remains an integrated research laboratory for the Air Force and Space Force, but the individuals, Space Force individuals, and the elements of the research laboratory that are reporting directly to the Space Force report through them, so it ties more closely our space acquisition with our S&T. The second thing it realigns the launch enterprise fully under Space Systems Command. Perhaps we'll talk about that a little more in the future, but launch is really a space system deployment activity, and so it's going to make that more efficient in the way that we conduct launch-related activities. And then finally, it prepares us, it brings in a stronger relationship with the Space Rapid Capabilities Office. It begins to establish a stronger relationship with the Space Development Agency so that as we move forward, we can better and more effectively integrate and unify all of those activities for acquiring and fielding space capabilities.
Thanks for running through that. One of the arguments for the creation of the Space Force was that it would help unify space acquisitions under one organization, right? Do you think Space Force has largely done that with the establishment of Space Systems Command, or is that something that needs to come still, or is that less a priority under the Space Force at this point in time?
It absolutely remains a priority. In fact, probably, as you said, still one of the top priorities for the Space Force and for the nation. This is the latest step, and by no means are we close to done. There's still much more work to do. A couple of additional things, as you and I think probably most of the audience members know, we are still working on elements of an alternative acquisition process that Congress has requested of us. We've been working it now for a couple of years with the Department of Defense, with OMB, and with members of Congress. The reorganization and the new structure for Space Systems Command helps that, but there's more work to do. Some of those elements of the approach that we're proposing, we've already implemented. We've pushed responsibility down to program managers. We've implemented we've provided them a head of contracting and contracting authority down to that level to be able to speed that. But there's more work to do. First of all, we'll continue to work with OSD in Congress. OSD has a report due today, or I'm sorry, not today, in May. that describes the work we're doing, the progress we're making. So that's an important piece. The other thing, and it's not as visible and not as talked about as much, the new Assistant Secretary of the Air Force Office for Space Acquisition and Integration is a large part of what we're doing to overhaul the acquisition system. The way it brings those acquisition organizations together, not just the new SSC and Space RCO, but the Department of the Air Force RCO office and MDA and SDA, even though it's not an official member of the Space Force, is participating there, the National Reconnaissance Office. So it's not just SSC. It's this new Assistant Secretary inside the Air Force, the work they're doing. It's continuing to push on the changes to the process. So I would call it an important step, but by no means are we done. And it absolutely, fixing that process absolutely remains a priority for the Space Force.
Understood. Can you give us a sense of the timeline that you are planning on for transitioning more organizations from the other services into the Space Force?
Sure. We are on a path right now. In fact, here in the last several months, we have finalized with the Army and the Navy. We finalized what we as all the services agree are the forces that should be transitioned in. I think previously decided and previously announced both the mobile user objective system, the Navy's UFO satellite system, both its operations, that system, its operations center, and the sustainment folks who support it are already in the process of the plan to transfer in the coming years. We've completed an agreement with the Army on what should transfer. I won't go into detail there because we want to finish the planning. We're gonna communicate what's happening together with the Army. They've been a good partner in that, but planning is underway. You can expect, I think, details from both services soon, and the timeline is in work now, and you'll see later this year and continuing into next year, it will be a phased process by which that transition occurs.
Excellent. You mentioned that the Space Systems Command creates a stronger relationship with Space Rapid Capabilities Office and the Space Development Agency, or at least begins to create that stronger relationship. However, at least during the planning discussions over the last, in 2020, it was suggested that those organizations would be under Space Systems Command. Has the planning for that changed? And if so, can you explain the rationale to keep those technically outside of that new organization?
Sure. As part of the planning activity, we looked at a broad range of organizational options, assessed them on a whole host of factors. In fact, we think that, and we also looked at the limitations and the constraints. And right now, by law, in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress specified that the Space Rapid Capabilities Office reports to the Chief of Space Operations. In 2021, Congress specified that when Space Development Agency transitions into the Space Force, it will report to the Chief of Space Operations. So in that case, in that sense right now, our ability to affect some of that is impacted by law. We have to comply with the law. Congress has taken special interest in this activity and these organizations like all of us. And so our first organizational construct moves us in the direction that we need to, and at the same time complies with laws we're required to do. Our desire and our intent is to continue to work with Congress, to continue to show them our vision, how we want it to work together, what organizational constructs we believe help facilitate that, and gain their support and advocacy, and obviously ensure that as we do that, we comply with law. So you can anticipate that as we move forward, we'll continue to look at ways to evolve SSE and some of those things. But in all cases, we'll consult with Congress, we'll work with Congress, and absolutely comply with the law.